In the last video, we learned about the two main building blocks of Platt's new RBAC module, user groups and securables, and learned how securables come in four types: API and APIX enforced by the server at the back end, and URL and DOM enforced by the browser at the front end. In this video, we'll look in detail at the back-end securable types, API and APIX, and run through some examples of their use. Under Platt's new RBAC module, all server requests are rejected by default. This means that members of a user group without any API or APIX securable selected would be unable to request any data from the server, rendering the system effectively useless. So all user groups will need some API and APIX items in their securables list. The question, of course, precisely what? In the case of the top-level admin user group, the objective is for members of this group to have unrestricted system access. And by far the simplest way to achieve this is to have these two default securables selected, all API requests and all APIX requests. You'll notice a question mark to the right of each item in this securables list. Clicking on this provides rapid access to the definition of the selected item. Let's right-click on this icon for the All API Requests selection and open that in a new tab. So here is the definition of the All API Requests securable. As you can see, there are a number of fields, but the selections in this case are very straightforward. The type is API. The data type, identifying the type of record this rule will apply to, is any. The access method, identifying whether this securable relates to accessing, updating, or deleting of records, is also any. And a selection of all here means that this securable will apply to all records of the selected type. The All APIX Request securable has an identical setup, except of course this time with the APIX type selected. Because server requests are rejected by default, there are two basic ways that users' back-end permissions can be defined. Either you use these All API and All APIX Requests securables to grant them access to everything, and then supplement this with exceptions to prevent them from performing particular requests, or you don't use these all request securables at all and instead list out all of the individual requests that users should have permission to make. The option that you choose will probably depend upon how restrictive you intend to be. If a group of users will have access to most things, then it will probably be quicker to supplement the all request securables with the necessary exceptions. If their access will be very limited, it will probably be quicker just to select a securable for each of the data types or individual records that they should be granted access to. The top-level basic user group actually uses a combination of these two approaches. Let's take a look at how the user group is set up. So here is the securables list for the basic user group defined against the top-level organization. As you can see, this is significantly longer than for the admin group. I'm going to use this filter so we can focus our attention on individual securable types. Firstly, for APIX securables, we see that all APIX requests has been added to the list, and then these invert logic checkboxes have been used to make a number of exceptions to this. These are specific APIX requests that basic users should not be permitted to make, such as invoice and payroll generation. Now let's take a look at the API selections. Here we see that all APIX requests has not been added to the list. Instead, a securable has been added for each individual data type. The objective here is to provide full access to all of the types of data that care managers are responsible for, such as events, runs, and, with the exception of system users, all people. And then read-only access to everything else. Let's drill down to a couple of these securables to look at their definitions. Firstly, I'll open the runs/rotors full access securable. Again, this is very simple. In fact, the only difference between this securable and the all API requests item that we were looking at earlier is that here we have the run data type selected. This people, everyone except system users full access securable is slightly more complicated because in the case of the person data type, we need to identify the relevant type or types of person using this views field. Here, we can either add an item for each type of person that should be regulated by this securable, so for example, client or care worker, or as has been done here, we can include a single item with a minus in front This is treated as applying to all types except for the one specified. In both of these two examples, the access update methods field is left on its default value of any, which means the securable will regulate access to, updating of, and deletion of the relevant type or types of data. Let's have a quick look now at one of the read-only items from the basic user group's securables list. In this case, we see how users are being granted permission to get event types, but not to update or delete them. To see the effect of having one of these read-only securables in my user group, I'm going to switch myself to be a member of this basic group. And now we can see how I am able to get event types, but not to update or delete them. All of the examples that we've looked at so far apply to all records, or all records of a particular type. In some cases, you may need to restrict API requests to an individual record. Perhaps, for example, I am a super user for a large organization that operates across a number of offices. In this case, there will probably be a parent organization with child organizations set up for each of the satellite offices. In this case, I might want to grant full access to all organizations to members of my super user group, but only grant the administrator for each of the individual satellite offices read-only access to that parent organization, along with full access to their own individual organizations. There are a couple of different ways to achieve an objective such as this. The first would be to set up securables that have the ID of the relevant record hard-coded into their definition. To demonstrate this, I will create a new securable and describe this as follows. The type will be API and the data type organization. This securable will relate to attempts to update or delete the demo care organization, so we'll select update and delete here. Now I said that in this example we would be hard coding the ID of demo care into the definition of the securable. This can be done using this URL field. Notice how the help for this field explains that if we have selected a data type above, as we have done, we should only enter the part of the URL that comes after that. So that means we're going to need a value for URL as follows. This is the ID of the demo care organization, then there's a / followed by 2 asterisks. The meaning of these asterisks is basically to say that if there is anything else in the URL coming after the record ID, it will still be covered by this securable. We might not need to put this here, but it's a good catch-all. After we have saved this new securable, you will notice that a usage summary is provided at the bottom of the page. This summarizes for us which user groups are currently using this securable. Of course, because it's a brand new record, it is not being used by any user groups yet. To add this new record to a user group's securables list, we could navigate to the relevant user group and add it manually from there. Alternatively, a shortcut is provided through this Add to User Groups button. But, as we can see, this button is currently disabled. Why is this? Well, the answer is that there are no user groups that I am currently able to add this securable to. If we open up the user groups list, by selecting the relevant item from the setup menu, we can see that there are currently only 3 user groups defined, and these are the ones set up as defaults against top level, which are read-only. As we cannot modify any of these user groups, the answer, of course, is to set up a new user group for use by my satellite office administrators. Let's do that now by selecting the admin user group, which will provide a useful template for my new group, and then selecting clone user group from the user group context menu. We now have a new user group with a copy of the securables list from the top level admin group. Let's give it a suitable name and then choose the appropriate organization. To add the new securable with the hard-coded record ID that we set up earlier to this new user group, we could go back and use the Add to User Groups button from the securables page. But as we're here now, we might as well just go ahead and add the item by clicking here and then typing in the first few letters that we gave to the description of our new securable earlier. As things now stand, members of this satellite admin group have permission to perform all API requests and permission to update and delete DemoCare. Of course, this is not quite what we'd intended. The final step is for us to click on this invert logic option so that members of this user group will be prevented from performing the corresponding actions. To test this, I will add myself to our new satellite admin user group. Next, I will navigate to one of the child organizations, Northern Area in this case, and verify that I am able to make a change. But if I navigate to DemoCare, the parent organization, and the one hard-coded into the securable we've just been setting up, I should be prevented from making an equivalent change. Hard-coding the ID of an individual record into the URL field of a securable provides a convenient way to restrict access to an individual record. However, if there were a number of records requiring this treatment, hard-coding each of their IDs into a different securable would become rather cumbersome. A better alternative in this case would be to set up a parameterized securable, which I will demonstrate now. Let's define another new securable. As this one is not going to be specifically for the DemoCare organization, I need a more general description than before. Something like this. As before, the type will be API, the data type will be organization, and the access update methods will be update and delete. This time I won't be using the URL field. Instead, I'm going to select parameter for this applies to field. Selecting parameter here specifies that each time this securable is added to the securables list of a user group, the record that it will apply to must be nominated. Precisely what that record can be will depend upon the selected data type. In this case, I've selected organization, so we'll be selecting an organization each time this securable is used. Of course, this means that our securable can be reused many times over, potentially for a different organization each time. Having saved this new parameterized securable, notice how the Add to User Groups button is now available. When clicking on this, we see that there is now one user group that this item can be added to. That being the satellite admin group that we set up a few moments ago. If there were any other user groups that we could add this securable to at the current time, additional checkboxes would be provided below. As we are dealing here with the parameterized user group, I need to specify which record this securable will apply to when added to the satellite admin group. And because I selected organization as the data type for the securable, I am required to select an organization. Let's select DemoCare. And I'll choose the invert logic option so that we are restricting access to DemoCare rather than granting it. And now, OK. After the page has refreshed, this usage summary at the bottom of the page confirms that our securable is now being used by the satellite admin group. We can see which organization I selected as the apply to record, in this case DemoCare, and that the logic is inverted, so we are restricting rather than granting the relevant permission. If I had been able to select additional user groups to add this securable to, they would be listed individually here. The names of the user groups currently using this securable are presented as a link. And I will click on this satellite admin link now to navigate to that record. Here we see that both the hard-coded DemoCare securable that I set up earlier and our new parameterized organization securable now appear in satellite admin securables list. Of course, the first of these is redundant, so let's remove it now. I mentioned earlier that each of DemoCare's satellite offices has its own administrator and that I wanted these administrators to have unrestricted access to their own organization together with read-only access to other organizations in the group. With its current setup, members of this satellite admin group are being prevented from updating and deleting DemoCare, but not from updating or deleting any of the satellite office organizations. To fully satisfy that requirement, we need a new approach. I'm going to start by removing the parameterized organization securable from this list. Don't worry, this securable is still required, just not here. Next, to tackle the first part of the requirement, I'm going to define one final new securable, this time for preventing updates or deletes to any organization. This is really just a simpler case to the previous two, not requiring a selection for either the URL or the applies to fields. Let's add this securable to the satellite admin group as before. So now members of Satellite Admin are unable to update or delete any organizations. This is one half of our requirement satisfied. How can we satisfy the second part of this requirement by granting individual Office administrators full access to just their own organization? Well, a good approach to this problem will be to leave the Satellite Admin group as it is now defined, and turn our attention to the user records for those individual Office administrators. Let's assume, for the sake of this example, that I am the administrator for the Northern Area Satellite Office. If we return to the Security tab for my own user record, we'll notice how we find a securables list here as well. This is my own personal securable list, allowing the permissions that are defined by my user group to be supplemented or overridden. My membership to the Satellite Admin group prevents me from updating or deleting any organizations, but as I do require update permission to the Northern Area organization, this can be added for just myself by selecting our parameterized organization securable here. And selecting just my own satellite office. Note that in this case we're not ticking on the invert logic button, as the goal here is to grant me permission to something that my user group would otherwise prevent me from doing. Before we finish, a quick test that everything is now working as intended. First, I will browse to the DemoCare organization. And verify that I'm unable to make an update here. Southern Area is another one of the satellite offices, but as this is not my organization, I should be prevented from saving updates here as well. But if I go to my office, as before, I should be able to make a change. Of course, each of the users who have admin responsibility at the other satellite offices could be granted update permission to the relevant organization in just the same way. And that concludes our introduction to API securables. As far as APIX securables are concerned, it is not possible for us to provide an entirely self-explanatory user interface for these, nor for me to cover that topic sufficiently thoroughly in a short video such as this. If you think that you may have a back-end security requirement not catered for by API securables, please talk to your Really Care representative who will be able to advise you further. Until then, any new user groups that you set up should include the All APIX Requests item in its securables list. In the next video, we'll be looking at the two front-end securable types, URL and DOM.